welcome to the debate. Today, we're tackling Article 7 of the U.S. Constitution. That critical, maybe often overlooked provision that set the actual rules for how the U.S. would transition from, well, a loose confederation into a functioning nation. Article 7 decreed that ratification by conventions in just 9 states would be sufficient to establish the new government among the states that approved it. This dramatically overturned the unanimity required under the old Articles of Confederation. I mean, this was nothing short of a legal revolution.
Absolutely. A revolution indeed. And the central question for us, I think, is this. Was Article 7's 9-state requirement primarily, a pragmatic political strategy designed to force unity? Or was it something more fundamental, an essential supermajoritarian mechanism that actually improved the quality and the desirability of the Constitution that resulted?
Right. And I'll argue that the need to secure that supermajority of the 9 states was crucial for producing a high-quality constitution. It forced the inclusion of vital protections and necessary compromises.
And I come at it from a slightly different angle. While Article 7 was certainly the legal exit ramp from the Articles, I maintain its objective was overwhelmingly strategic. It was primarily a political lever. The real goal, I believe, wasn't to settle for some unstable 9-state union, but rather to use the threat of exclusion and the political momentum of the new compact to essentially coerce all 13 states into participation.
Okay, I appreciate the focus on let's say, the political maneuvering of the era, but let's start with the profound legal and philosophical implications of that 9-state rule. The fact that the requirement was 9 out of 13 makes Article V a strict supermajority rule. And well, why does that matter when establishing a foundational document like this? Because supermajority rules are really built to create durability. They demand consensus support, which acts as a powerful prophylactic against strong opposition and helps prevent the kind of persistent discord that, frankly, plagued the previous confederation. This requirement, it forced better decision-making from the drafters. They couldn't simply design a document that pleased the simple majority of states, They had to achieve broad, diverse buy-in. This necessity forced them to temper their own political aspirations and focus on structures that served the wider public interest, structures that guaranteed rights and balanced state and federal power. And the evidence is pretty clear. The path to securing that 9th state, it forced the inclusion of robust constitutional federalism and, critically, pressured the Federalists to promise the Bill of Rights protections they might have easily avoided under a weaker threshold, say a simple majority.
That's a compelling argument regarding let's call them the theoretical benefits of supermajority rules. But I just don't quite buy that the framers' primary intent here was constitutional desirability achieved through pure consensus. Let's look at the actual political reality of 1787, 1788. We know from their own writings, the Federalist Papers, for example, that the Federalists saw a partial union, say just 9 states, as dangerous. Hamilton called it potentially pernicious and destructive. So if they genuinely believed anything less than 13 was a disaster, then Article 7's goal couldn't have been settling for 9. It had to be, as you hinted, solely to get 13.
Okay. Central weakness of the Articles. The power of holdout states like, Rhode Island famously, to block the entire Union. It was designed very cleverly to create increasing returns. Once 5 or 6 large states ratified, the political pressure, or perhaps more accurately, the fear of isolation, just became overwhelming for the remaining states. Think about New York, Virginia, Massachusetts. Did they ratify because they suddenly decided the Constitution was perfect in every detail? I'd argue no. They ratified largely out of the recognized high-stakes fear of being left out of the emerging economic and political union. The choice imposed wasn't really a vote on merit, but more of an ultimatum. Join immediately or face the consequences of being outside the new federal structure. That sounds much more like coercion than pure consensus building.
But if the goal was primarily coercion, why set the bar at 9? Why not a simple majority of 7? That would have put ratification within much easier reach and arguably maximize that political leverage even faster. I see why you emphasize the necessity argument, the fear of being left out, but the supermajority threshold itself, the difficulty of reaching 9, ensured the initial product had to be structurally sound and palatable enough to attract that broad support in the first place. That structural soundness, born from needing 9, could then serve as a genuine source of allegiance, not just forced compliance.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have to look at the vehicle they chose, state conventions, rather than the existing state legislatures. That key move the framers made, getting rid of the legislatures for this specific purpose and turning straight to the conventions, this was based on a fundamental principle, right? That the Constitution should be an act of the people, giving it a kind of fundamental superiority over mere legislative decisions. The sheer logistical difficulty and, frankly, the political risk of persuading the people, state by state, through these special conventions, it kind of undermines the idea that this was purely a fast-track political strategy targeting legislative self-interest. It was framed, at least, as an exercise in fundamental sovereignty that required a deep investment from the citizenry themselves.
The problem, though, is that even when filtering the decision through these people's conventions, the vote wasn't really on desirability but on political necessity. The critical issue here, as historians like Jack Rakoff have pointed out, is that the conventions had to swallow the document whole. There was simply no opportunity for Americans to vote piecemeal on the specific constitutional structures, say, do we like this bicameral legislature, or are these specific powers granted to the executive appropriate? You were voting for the Union, full stop.
Right. It was an up or down vote on the whole thing.
Exactly. And the decision was driven by that recognized, almost existential need to be in the Union. Madison himself argued quite forcefully that the absurdity of subjecting the fate of 12 states to the corruption or perverseness of a single 13th state dictated the 9-state rule. Now, that's an argument rooted squarely in preventing political catastrophe, not necessarily an argument primarily committed to generating the absolute highest quality, most desirable document possible in the abstract.
That's an interesting point, though I might frame the necessity aspect slightly differently. I agree the necessity of union was the backdrop, the context for everything, but the practical necessity of achieving 9 states, specifically that number, fundamentally shaped the final document, and I argue, for the better. The supermajority was an indispensable architectural constraint on the drafters themselves.
How so, specifically?
Well, think of it this way. If 7 states, a simple majority, had been sufficient, the Federalists would have had far less incentive to compromise on key issues. They could perhaps have created a document that heavily centralized power, severely limiting the state's role, knowing they could get 7 votes relatively easily. But needing 9 required them to woo large, skeptical states like Massachusetts and Virginia. This forced them to guarantee the fundamental federal structure and, perhaps most importantly, to promise a subsequent Bill of Rights. That promise, that concession, was arguably the cost of reaching the supermajority threshold. If 7 states were enough, that cost might likely never have been paid. So, in this view, Article 7 was directly responsible for embedding some of the Constitution's most desirable liberties-protecting provisions right into the foundation of the law.
I'm still not entirely convinced that the necessity of compromise was driven primarily by Article 7 itself, rather than by the overwhelming political momentum that Article 7 so successfully generated. If the political necessity of joining the Union was truly paramount, and I think the evidence suggests it was, then Americans likely would have accepted almost any set of institutional arrangements the Federalists put forward, maybe even arrangements mirroring less desirable constitutions from other nations at the time, simply because the alternative was disunion and potential economic ruin. The political program, the structure of the choice, essentially guaranteed Americans wouldn't really have the chance to evaluate whether the specific constitutional schemes were particularly desirable. They just had to take the whole package or face, disaster.
Okay.
Furthermore, this highly strategic, maybe even rushed, approach created significant conceptual paradoxes that really highlight the legal messiness introduced by this pragmatic decision. For example, what was the exact legal status of states that hadn't ratified yet, like Rhode Island or North Carolina, after New Hampshire became the 9th state on June 21, 1788?
Right. The holdouts.
Exactly. Under the Articles of Confederation, they were still legally part of the United States, but Article 7 explicitly declared that the Constitution would be established only among the ratifying states. So were these holdouts now functionally separate nations? Could they be treated as foreign territory? Were they merely unattached states that could join later without seeking, say, congressional permission?
The Constitution is notably silent on this crucial point, likely because the framers just assumed, or perhaps strongly hoped, everyone would join eventually. This ambiguity, I argue, is a direct result of prioritizing political effectiveness over complete conceptual clarity.
Well, I certainly concede that the status of those holdout states was murky. It was a political detail left unresolved at the moment of transition. But Article 7 did decisively establish the new legal reality. It clearly stated the Constitution would be established between the states so ratifying the same. Full stop.
But that reality created the ambiguity.
Yes, but this ambiguity, far from being solely a weakness, actually set the groundwork for future conceptual debates that proved vital to the nation's endurance. Think about Chief Justice Marshall, for instance. He later relied specifically on Article 7's use of state conventions to argue that the Constitution wasn't just a compact between sovereign states, but an emanation of the people of the nation as a whole, acting through the conventions, perhaps for convenience. This reading, which emphasizes the indivisibility of the Union, contrasts sharply, as we know, with the later Confederate interpretation of Article 7. They viewed ratification as an act of the sovereign people of the state, an act which, in their view, could be repealed through subsequent state conventions during secession. So, Article 7, despite its arguably messy political origins, provided the critical legal tool used later to articulate the enduring, permanent nature of the Union itself.
I agree that Marshall certainly leveraged Article 7 retrospectively to solidify the Union's structure and his view of it, but I maintain the initial maneuver was rooted much more in, shall we say, naked power politics, intended to resolve an immediate governance crisis. The long-term legal and conceptual clarity, or at least the dominant interpretation of it, came later, articulated by jurists precisely to resolve the competing interpretations of what ratification actually signified.
So, to summarize my position, Article 7's supermajority requirement wasn't just a number. It was a critical mechanism for ensuring the quality and the ultimate desirability of the Constitution. By demanding 9 states, it forced the framers into a difficult but productive consensus-building exercise. This embedded essential structural and individual protections, notably constitutional federalism and the Promised Bill of Rights, right into the document's foundation, making the Constitution a genuine and durable source of allegiance for a diverse nation.
And my position remains that Article 7 was primarily an engine of political momentum. It expertly capitalized on the very real existential fear of disunion, effectively coercing states to ratify the Constitution as a necessity for survival, rather than as a fully considered judgment on the specific desirability of its institutional arrangements. This strategic coercion was undoubtedly effective in resolving the crisis of the Articles of Confederation, but its pragmatic, maybe even hurried nature inevitably left significant legal and conceptual paradoxes about the nature of the resulting union unaddressed at the time.
Well, whether the Constitution's establishment was driven primarily by political expediency or by a deliberate, if difficult, process of consensus building, Article 7 remains perhaps the single most important legal pivot in American history.
Agreed. It established the foundational rules for how a nation, struggling under its own institutional inertia, could fundamentally restructure its governance. And it certainly leaves a rich field for ongoing study regarding how foundational legal documents achieve legitimacy and are adopted in the real world.